But that is what it is, and we look forward to engaging around the terms of this argument. So I want to return to some of the points which Mark went over, and in particular this understanding the phenomenon which we're dealing with now, which I think pushes very strongly against so many of the dominant consensuses, that this is what we're dealing with fundamentally with, is a kind of a criminal network that has seized power, fundamentally driven by self-interest or motivated by corruption. And what we've done is, I think we've tried to periodize these moments and realize that this is a phenomenon which has emerged within a particular context. And this is this context which I want to spend a little bit more time thinking around, and thinking especially around 2007, which is Polokwane. And I think we have to recognize Polokwane as a fundamental rupture, and an important rupture, one which is premised on a disillusionment and a profound and I think important and legitimate critique of the Mbeki years. One founded on the understanding that what the Mbeki years have produced is, yes, the fastest economic growth we've had in 30, 40 years, but an economic growth trajectory that has produced a small black elite, a profoundly vulnerable black middle class, and then vast economic exclusion. And I think within that circle, from 2007, what you start seeing is the pursuit or the search for another model of economic transformation. As it says, the current economic trajectory is fundamentally unsustainable. Unsustainable in its current form. The structures of the economy are unsustainable. It's always been at the heart of the radical critique of South Africa that the structures of the South African capitalist economy are incapable of realizing real or genuine development. And I think, and we're living through that. So I think the Polokwane moment is profound in a conviction of a sense that the economy needs to be fundamentally transformed. And what you start seeing in a whole range of locations within South African society, and including within the ANC and in state organizations, the pursuit for other kinds of models of economic transformation. So we see, for example, the ANC Youth League under Julius Malema returning to the principles of the Freedom Charter, this model of nationalization, and we see the economic freedom fighters today standing by this model of the nationalization of land and of key components of the economy. But what is important in this time is that other ideas are beginning to circulate, rather than simply the nationalization, ones which are still favorable to a market or capitalist economy, but seeking to produce a different kind of economy. As Mark said, not one dependent on the coattails of a white capital. The Mbeki project is trying to incentivize or push white capital to reform itself through black changing ownership patterns, but also through affirmative action, and a sense of profound failure in this regard, the lethargy, the resistance of white capital to transform itself, looking for new models. And emerging, we think, within the Department of Trade and Industry, but also within the Black Management Forum, is this idea starting to circulate of transforming the economy, of producing a new kind of economy, a new black economy. And how does one do it? You see the excitement in early documents from about 2010, 2011, especially coming out of DTI, of leveraging the procurement budgets of state-owned enterprises to advance a new economy, privileging procurement of black-owned and black-controlled firms to displace established white firms and produce this new kind of economy, a new black 100 black industrialists is a DTI document. There's a document which we find from DTI where the first time you hear the expression radical economic transformation, it comes out of that document, and there's a list of 13 state-owned enterprises, and they've added up the procurement budget, and alone in those 13 companies, there's 200 billion rand available to the state to advance this new model of economic transformation. And when you think about it, the ideas are thoroughly compelling. It also resonates profoundly with work that Parry's been doing for some time now around how government is increasingly informed in good faith by models of public management, increasingly shifting to a model of governance through procurement. So we've been seeing since 2000 in particular, massive decentralization of procurement budgets across the state. Essentially, our government and our government departments, they work through outsourcing. All government's work is essentially outsourced to third-party third-party service providers and private companies. So it resonates within that spirit of the new public management and management thinking around transforming the state, but also it's improving its efficiencies. And I think this feeds into or resonates very strongly with ideas coming out of the Black Management Forum. What is so attractive about it is it's retaining the idea of a market economy operating within the framework of capitalism, but using capitalism through the state to produce a new kind of economy. We argue that at some point around 2011, the project of radical economic transformation itself radicalizes. So radical economic transformation radicalizes. So radical economic transformation is the name of using state-owned enterprises and procurement budgets to create this new black economy. In about 2011, 2012, the project itself radicalizes, and we increasingly start seeing that the proponents of radical economic transformation start setting themselves up against the Constitution. And the argument begins to emerge around that time, and I think the argument is contingent, it's not necessary. The idea being that you cannot prosecute this new radical project of transformation within the framework of the Constitution. And we start increasingly seeing and a sense that this project must be or can only be done unlawfully and outside the Constitution. We think that there is one of the key, of course it's resonating with all sorts of discourses happening in wider society, the fallist movements across the universities, for example, the repudiation of the idea of the transition as an elite compact, and the Constitution as an expression of this elite compact, the influence of subaltern studies in the South African academic programs, versions of ultra-leftism in South Africa. All of them are increasingly critical of the Constitution and its relationship to the present. But there's something particular about our South African Constitution which I think draws the ire of the Black Management Forum and other protagonists of radical economic transformation. Rather, and maybe the writers of our constitutions had a real premonition about what the future held, because very, very unusually, the South African Constitution includes the National Treasury as a constitutional body, but more than that, bizarrely, Section 22(1) includes procurement as a constitutional matter. In other words, the way in which procurement happens, public procurement, is not at the discretion of legislation or policy or regulation or the mood of public officials. It's a constitutional matter. And in Section 217, the Constitution requires government to balance two principles, which we think of as reconcilable. The first is fair price. In other words, the procurement has to be of value to citizens. And what it does is it insists that a good price must be considered in procurement matters. The second principle is equity of economic transformation. And the Constitution, I think, clearly believes that these principles are reconcilable, that there's no contradiction between them. From 2012, we are increasingly aware that within the Black Management Forum, within DTI, and within other radical circles, the argument increasingly emerges that these two principles are fundamentally in contradiction. Black Management Forum and other protagonists of radical economic transformation are arguing very, very strongly that preferential procurement must privilege black economic considerations rather than price. And they are insisting that National Treasury change the preferential procurement criteria to privilege questions of race over questions of price. There's a huge push. There's a moment in December 2011, in June 2011, when Pravin Gordon signs a recognition of this new situation, and then he does something extraordinary in December of the same year. He excludes the state-owned enterprises from this new consideration. In other words, he recognizes that in preferential procurement, race will trump price, but he excludes that consideration for the state-owned enterprises. And we can see it provokes the tremendous ire of the protagonists of radical economic transformation within government. And I think it's from that moment on, there's a sense that the idea of radical economic transformation cannot be achieved within the framework of the Constitution and within the framework of the law. And we increasingly start seeing moves towards illegality. So the report spends a lot of time going through a chronology of the events around during that period. I welcome you to read it because some of it is in the public domain. Amma Bongani has been terrific in reporting on some of these stories. It's the stuff which we're familiar with. It is astonishing stuff. I mean, the story which just crystallizes the shift to illegality is just quite incredible. So Malusi Gigaba becomes the Minister of Public Enterprises. Brian Molefe is appointed as the CEO of Transnet. There's huge expansion of state and commissions of state-owned enterprises. And the terms of the contract are, as the public protector put it, are legally dubious to say the least. My one, which I find just extraordinary, and it's a story which you well know, it's the story of Tegeta, Optimum Mine. I appeal to you to go and have a look at the website of the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer in the National Treasury, because it reports on it. I'm not making this up, but it's extraordinary. So we know the circumstances where Glencore, which is then by that stage owned by Exxaro, a black-owned and black-controlled company, the Optimum mine is forced into bankruptcy so that the Guptas can buy that mine. The same pile of low-quality coal, which has historically been sold to Eskom power stations for 167 rand a tonne, the cost is subsidised by the fact that Glencore is selling the high-quality coal on the international market, is now owned by a company called Tegeta, controlled by the Guptas. It's the same poor quality coal sold to the same power stations, but this time the price is 700 rand per tonne. So if you go to the OCPO site, you see something extraordinary, very low-key. The contract value in 2016 is 325 million rand per annum. It rises to 7 billion rand. It's the same pile of coal. It's the same pile of low-quality coal that goes from 325 million to 7 billion rand. There are lots and lots of these kinds of stories. It's almost certainly happening in ways that are illegal, and we look forward to the days when that actually gets tested in court. Within that framework, we see, in order to continue in this way, all sorts of investigative capacity within the state gets closed down, or there are moves against it. The first is SARS, with the appointment of Tom Moyane in 2014, and I'm very, very honoured and pleased to see that Ivan Pillay has joined us today. The extraordinary assault on the management of the South African Revenue Services, which starts at the end of 2014, primarily against SARS's quite formidable investigative capacity, which they built up over the years, and is starting to investigate politically connected people. SARS management is dismantled and purged under extraordinary and outrageous circumstances, which in many cases we're still living with. Trumped up charges of fraud, etc. We saw the drama of the Hawks investigating and charging Praveen Gordon and not charging, calling them in for meetings at the Hawks offices last year. Outrageous stuff. We see the same things happening at the Hawks, and what Dramat is displaced. Also, on extraordinary, trumped up charges of the illegal rendition of Zimbabweans. But we see this across the Hawks. Shadrach Sibia, who's head of the Hawks in Gauteng, removed, also beginning to investigate what he's investigating Mdluli from crime intelligence, pushed out in similar circumstances. The head of the Hawks in KZN, also General Boyson, also pushed out. Similar sorts of circumstances, accused of running a hit squad by the media and pushed out. So there's an increasing move to eliminate or control investigative capacity within the state. At the same time, as Mark mentioned, cabinet processes are beginning to weaken. Increasingly, cabinet decisions are taking place not within cabinet, but within interministerial committees, composed of a couple of hand-picked members of Jacob Zuma's cabinet. We think, in this regard, what is increasingly happening is that the project of radical economic transformation does not just set itself up against the Constitution, but as long as it is no longer operating within the law, it's susceptible to criminalization. And this is what we think is beginning to happen. So this idea of power shifting away from government, it's shifting away from certainly from Parliament, it's shifting away from cabinet itself into these dispersed, what we've called kitchen cabinets, located in a whole range of places. Interministerial committees, the intelligence networks in South Africa as well. Saxon World, the Gupta home, is clearly another one, but it's merely one of them. So I think what we're living with in South Africa today, and this is where we have to recognize, is that it's driven by a political conviction. We're not just seeing a criminal network take power. We are seeing a criminal network take power in the context of a conviction that radical economic transformation is unachievable within the framework of South Africa's constitution. It's a conviction which I think is supported by all sorts of radical discourses coming out of various movements and academic discourses as well. A profound skepticism that the transition from apartheid was something of great value. a sense that the transition was actually somehow an elite pact, a bargain between elites that doesn't provide the basis for real, genuine transformation in South Africa. I think it's that consensus, that idea, which has informed this project, which we need to confront head on and recognize our own complicity within it, from the academy, from various social movements, from various political movements, and if you like, we have to reaffirm our notion of the Constitution. So I had the pleasure of being part of an event on Saturday in Cape Town with Justice Moseneke, and what was astonishing about the way he spoke was a sense of the extraordinary potential of the South African Constitution, certainly not as a liberal document, but as a powerful the instrument of progressive change in South Africa. And a document which creates huge space for us to achieve quite dramatic changes to the existing constitution of the economy, and foreground within society progressive egalitarian values at the heart of the South African social formation. I think what we're seeing now is a political project which repudiates those principles, a project which repudiates the ideas implicit or inherent in the South African Constitution. And I think the consequences are very, very dire. So we're living in that moment now. And I think that there's an opportunity in this particular moment to reaffirm that relationship between constitutionalism, democracy, and radical development in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Gobo.
Thanks. Just first to say that I feel great honor to be part of this state capacity research group. Many are wondering what is new about the things that are being done in the context of the work of this group. Have we not heard all of this before? Have we not seen it in the media? Have we not seen revelations leaked in all sorts of forums and forms? Our take is academic in essence. So we have sought to make sense of what is unfathomable, to try and make sense of, to bring the pieces together, to try and join the dots, to use Pravin Gordon's language. So we've looked at the nature in which this animal works, in which this phenomenon operates, the ways in which different actors in the state and outside of the state work together to achieve certain perverse ends. And we've tried to move away from looking at corruption as an isolated event, or as dots that are just scattered with no relations to one another, to see this lens of seeing corruption as corruption in government as a matter of a few rotten apples, rather than to see it as an orchard that is accursed. So we tried to provide a conceptual frame for understanding what exactly is happening, and we make a very strong point that this is an organized phenomenon, that this is a deliberate criminalization of the state. There are individuals that there's a division of labor in this process. And I'm going to talk about this division of labor where you have a different set of individuals that are playing unique kinds of roles that are all directed at furthering this systematic criminalization of the state. So there are clearly two parallel states that we've seen emerging in South Africa, as I think as Mark alluded to briefly. One is a constitutional state made up of modern the modern bureaucratic institutions on the one hand, underpinned by the Constitution, and then you have a parallel manifestation of the state made up of a shadowy network, highly informalized and linked to President Jacob Zuma and the Gupta family. So if you like, they sit at the top of the table, and then you have this cascading levels of elites, brokers, and dealers, and we're going to talk about each. Now, this is not very unique in South Africa. It's not a unique African phenomenon. It's not, for many years you've seen this practice and tendency taking place mainly in authoritarian regimes, but increasingly you also see it taking place in democratic polities. There are many examples of how authoritarian states manifest these tendencies, from African states to more sophisticated mafia states such as Russia. We've seen it taking place in places such as Venezuela. But more recently, you'd find this enmeshment of shadowy group and the bureaucratic institutions that tie all the way back to the president in contexts such as your Brazil, and the way the trajectory of that country's economic and political decline pretty much is mirrored in what's happening in South Africa, and there are grave implications for the poor, for the marginalized, for those that are outside of the state, the middle classes. So so it shouldn't be taken for granted, therefore, that if a country has a democratic rule and has institutions that are thriving, has robust institutions, it cannot be infiltrated by shadowy networks. So, I mean, if you look at some of the ANC documents that have, I think, emerged since Polokwane, there was a document that talked about the second transition, which, in my view, sought to lay the basis for some of the thinking that is contained in the articulation of radical economic transformation. Because the argument in that document was that the constitutional pact, the democratic dispensation that we negotiated in 1994 was inadequate. It failed to take care of the vast socio-economic inequalities in the country. It failed to change the patterns of property relations between black and white. It failed to address race-based cleavages in society. And this is, in a sense, an attempt to find ways of legitimating processes and approaches that deviate from the Constitution, that undermine formal institutions and that legitimate systematic corruption within the state. When you hear discussions around the failures of the 1994 project, and some would say, the 1996 class project, there's no appreciation. They want to brush aside clear evidence of corruption within the state or in state-owned enterprises. I mean, one professor, I think it was Professor Maligane, who was articulating this proposition of radical economic transformation, said that, people talk about kleptocratic state, they talk about a corrupt state. This is marginal. This is not the real issue. The real issue is that we have a white monopoly capital that dominates the commanding heights of the economy, without providing a nuanced discussion of the composition of capital today and the very complex ways in which the domestic connects connects to the global. And the very fact that if you want to see capital today, the real owners of capital, you are unlikely to meet an individual. You have institutional investors, pension funds, mutual funds, sovereign wealth funds. You have countries such as China that have given bulk of their wealth to these institutional investors to manage it for them, and they are heavily invested in what you call white monopoly capital. You have PIC that is also locked into what you call white monopoly capital, and you don't provide a proper historical lineage of this idea. First with Lenin in 1905, when he looked at, one of his case study was the South African mining space during the conglomeration era, and his debates on the need for to break, his conceptualization of monopoly capital at the time was out-argued by some of his interlocutors, and this was articulated by Stalin in 1950 to talk about the need for state monopoly capital that was going to drive massive industrialization, heavy industry. And we saw what happened as a result during that era. A lot of violence was legitimated. A lot of the productive capabilities of the state were throttled in the name of building a state monopoly capital, where the concept stamako comes from, the state monopoly capital. So how does this shadowy state manifest itself in South Africa today? We argue that you have at the top the controller, and the controller is essentially President Zuma and the Guptas. So Zuma gives political legitimacy to the functioning of this layer, of this network below this layer, and there is a pact between this shadowy business elite, this powerful business elite in the form of the Gupta family, and the president, and then below that, you have a layer of elites that are established to set out structures for the patronage networks and to facilitate the distribution of benefits. Now, the elites, some of the examples of these elites are your Ace Makashule, your Faith Mutambi, your Malusi Gigaba, your Brian Mulife, your Musebenzi Zwane, your Anoj Singh. And they facilitate the flow of this patronage. They are the one who carefully pick those at the bottom who could prize open the institutional limits to accessing resources. For an example, you'd find at the bottom typically a CEO of a state-owned enterprise, the chief financial officer, and in some instances the chief legal officer, because they know how to manipulate what appears, how to manipulate the legal processes within the organization and prize open opportunities for things to happen without detection, either by those who are outside. So below that you have the brokers, and these, if you like, are runners, and they have the ability to control the movement of and access to these resources. And below at the base, you have dealers, because there is a connection between what happens in these state-owned enterprises, the flow of funds to this shadowy business elite, and connections to international clearing centers such as Hong Kong, where, because you have to use a network of money laundering, layering this money and cleaning it out on the other side, and it is received by the elite that is connected to the controller of the network. Either it's received either through purchasing property abroad or through reinvestment abroad, and so on. So this is done. I mean, there's a very complex network of flows of finance that entails the use of shell companies. Now you can understand why the Financial Intelligence Center Amendment Act sat with President Zuma for over 2 years, creating deep vulnerabilities for South Africa from organized criminal networks that are international and domestic. And in this fashion, this makes President Zuma really a grave security threat to the country. This makes the president, who sits at the apex of the state, a grave security threat to constitutional democracy, a grave security threat to the economic security of the majority of South Africans who are likely to bear the brunt of the institutional decay in the state. So the report in this particular chapter goes into detail in mapping out the relationship between individuals at these different layers, as well as different entities that have been established as brokers, as elites, as entrepreneurs in inverted commas, that facilitate this pillage of state resources. It also makes connections between what's happening at Treasury today and what happened in state-owned enterprises yesterday. And the final point I want to make here is that individuals such as there are individuals that are seen as kind of innocent and neutral today. The current Minister of Finance is seen as someone who, don't touch this chap because give him a chance. He is still finding his way. Why are you judging him early on? Yet, where the state-owned enterprises are today are as a result of what he did in 2010 when he was appointed. He oversaw the collapse, the institutional decay of state-owned enterprises as we know them today. So we should not forget that. SAA, he was aware of the summoning of Vuyisile Kona to Saxon World, where they also offered him the kinds of monies that Mcebisi Jonas was that were dangled in front of Mcebisi Jonas. So this thing has been going on for some time. It's systematic. It's institutional. It's not a case of a few rotten apples. It's seeped deep into the sinuses of the state and its agencies. Thanks.
I think so.
Thank you, Prof. Ms. Mbete?
Thanks.
I'm just checking. Yeah, this mic is good.
I left my timer here. That is why I'm good.
Wow, thank you very much to the research team for their insights. There's a lot in here. I got it only when I arrived here to read it, so I've been trying to work my way through the report. And from what I've read, and then from the remarks that have been made before I've started to speak, I want to touch on three things, or on three separate ideas or observations, really, from this project, from what I've gleaned this afternoon and this evening. And the first is going to be my academic or my sort of analytical observations about specifically, or especially the analytical framework and the argument, as Ida put it, that is being made in this report. The second, because I teach in a political science department and I comment on South African politics, I want to talk a little bit about the political implications of this report. And then finally, because I'm the youngest person on this panel, I want to talk a little bit about the implications for the future. And I think that ideas that have come to me about what this means really for where South Africa is going. So the first around the academic and the analytical observations is that I think that this has been a really an excellent response to Pravin Gordon's challenge. We heard him a lot in his new position as an MP in the Public Enterprises Portfolio Committee. We heard him repeat again this idea of we need to connect the dots. And I think that that's what academics are for. And so one of the things that is important about this project, and important about this project also is a collaboration between several of our universities, is that it is academics doing the job that they're supposed to do, which is to make sense of society, to make sense of the political and the economic and the social dynamics that we see in our society. And I think that this is a challenge that not only South African academics are facing, but from what you read and you hear from the United States, from the United Kingdom in their particular moments, is academics really doing a lot of soul searching about how did we not predict this, and how do we then understand this particular moment. So I think it's important in that respect. And so having said that, I am interested then in the argument that is presented by the report, which is basically that what we are seeing and what we've been calling state capture, what we've been looking at particularly through the lens of corruption and our corruption legislation in South Africa is particular in that it really does define corruption as the use of public resources for private gain. And that is the way in which we've been looking at the political events that have taken place and all the chopping and changing. And so what this report seeks to do is to say that no, actually that lens of looking at things is incorrect, that there is something more systemic or systematic going on here, and it's a political project, and the way that they put it is of repurposing state institutions for the purposes of creating a new power elite, but also of restructuring the economy. And I think that that's a very interesting and an important nuance and a sophistication in addition to the way in which we've been analyzing things. I'm just not entirely convinced at this stage that that distinction between the corruption and the political project is drawn as clearly as the report makes it out to be in the introduction and also in the conclusion. Because it is very clear that what is taking place is the use of public resources for the benefit of a great deal of private individuals. So that there may be a broader political project that is being thought of to start this process, but what I've very nicely called the radicalization of the project is actually just the reduction of what seems to have been a big political project to just old-fashioned corruption as we know it and as we understand it. So, and perhaps these are then things that will be clarified as the smaller reports are done on particular case studies. And the reason why I think it is important to make that distinction or to be concerned about the distinction or the conflation of the corruption and the political project is that the political project itself is not necessarily illegitimate. One of the things that is brought up, including in this panel, is the sheer unsustainability of the South African economic structure. It's not sustainable, and it's immoral. So that my concern, I think that there is a risk then in conflating this idea and an analysis of what may be a political project with the fact that it is being used for corrupt purposes, that there's a real risk of delegitimizing a legitimate and necessary political project of let's call it radical economic transformation that needs to take place. So that's just a first sort of academic concern and comment. I suppose linked to that then is that it's still not clear to me, and it was interesting listening to Iva and Mzu and sort of their their framings of things in the diagram that's on page 56 of the report, with the model of the patronage network, it's still not clear to me what role exactly we say the Guptas play. Are they the controllers? Are they brokers? Or have they been at varying points dealers really in this whole system? And the reason why, so that's the first thing about the Guptas. The second thing about the Guptas is that we hear, and this might be just because I've been picking things out of the report, but that there are several kitchen cabinets. And instinctively, as somebody that worked in government while some of this stuff was happening, it seems to me correct to say that there are kitchen cabinets and that the power, the center of government power has moved from the executive. So intuitively, that sounds right to me. But at the moment, the kitchen cabinet that is spoken about the most in the most detail is the Gupta kitchen cabinet, is Saxonville. The Prof and I were just wondering whether property prices in Saxonville have gone up now that it's in the papers all the time. And I think that there's something then important for the analysis then about working out what exactly the position of the Guptas is. Have they become controllers and puppeteers? Are they still only brokers, firstly? Secondly, if they are one of many kitchen cabinets, where are the others and who is in the others and how are they benefiting? Because what we know about the Guptas, and on page 60 of this report, what is stated is a table of outflows of money from Gupta-linked companies and individuals. And to prevent myself from embarrassing myself like the man of the moment that we keep talking about, the president, I'm going to read the sums in US dollar terms, not in rand terms. Because if you read the sums in rand terms, the numbers are really big. So in dollar terms, I mean, there's here the Gupta-linked South African entities. Between December 2012 and May 2016, $485 million left the country. Between late 2014 and early, so that $485 million leaves to Gupta family members or Gupta-linked entities offshore, so out of South Africa. Late 2014 to early 2015, one of the companies, Homix, going to Bapu Trading, presumably also offshore, is $13 million. Then there's a $3 million amount in May 2015. And then April to September 2016 to a group of Hong Kong-based companies, and this is new information that isn't in the public domain, there's $240 million that leaves South Africa. And so, I mean, if you've got this replicated across kitchen cabinets, it's a bit scary, and it's something that needs to be, that I think would be great for further clarity in the project as it goes on. I now want to move to the political observations that I make from this project, and about what this means for our political moment. I think that, you know, one of the points that is made in the introduction, and Mark started with it as well, was this idea of the ANC no longer being the center of the transformation project in South Africa. And that the ANC's position really, its hegemonic position in the country, in the government and governance, has really been eroded through this political project, which I agree with. However, I draw then a different conclusion to the one that seems to be implied in the report, which is that towards the end of the report and as the conclusion, there is a suggestions for how to resolve the current crisis, and one of the suggestions is about the need for a new national economic consensus, which is what Mark spoke about. What I would say as well, and what I would add to that, is that we need a new political consensus that is not reliant on the morality of the ANC to survive. Because the problem is that as a country, we have outgrown the ANC, clearly. And what we need is a public center. We need a center, we need a political center, we need a development center, we need a moral center, an ethical center that isn't Luthuli House. Because even any efforts to try to reform Luthuli House right now, to make it become better, and I do think that we need a better Luthuli House than the one that we have, I don't think that what comes after or what needs to be there in the future still must be centered on the ANC. Because what we've seen is that the problem with centering your ethical livelihood your ethical life as a country, and then also your economic livelihood and your political functioning to a political party, is that that party, no matter what party it is, so speak to people in the Western Cape, speak to activists in the Western Cape or in the city of Cape Town that live under a DA-run administration, and they will tell you too. It's very easy for political parties to be captured and to be manipulated. So we need to think not only of an economic consensus, but also the political consensus that that isn't as reliant on a single party. And I was at the same event that Ivo was at with the Chief Justice, and one of the things that we were speaking about is how the part of the Constitution is great in the Bill of Rights, and then it actually gets a little bit hazy with the mechanics of democracy. And which is why we had a bunch of lawyers sitting in the Constitutional Court for hours the other Monday, talking effectively about a political problem. And part of the things about the political part of the Constitution, or the democratic mechanics part of the Constitution, is that they're written with the assumption of a governing party with integrity and that's self-regulating. And that's deeply idealistic. And then lastly, talking about the future, which I've done a little bit about talking about us needing a new political consensus. I think that whatever comes out of this debate and in the conversations that we're still going to have about this political moment and whether nuclear happens or not, or what we mustn't forget is that South Africa's future is dependent on a more ethical, more equal, more just economic distribution. South Africa will not exist in 50 years if that is not done. And so all the arguments that are being made must not undermine that fundamental truth. The second thing for me, for the future, and I suppose the future of this research project as well, is that something that isn't explored in this report, but I think that would be worth exploring in future, is actually the similarities of the current corruption movement or movement/political project and different stages of the National Party in power. Because I think there's a great deal more similarity. Henny van Vuuren's just released his book, The Apartheid, Guns and Money. And there's a great deal more continuity and similarity in the ways in which state power, financial capital and the banks, and then also the security agencies, so intelligence, and all sorts of other arms of criminal justice operate. And I think there's far greater continuities within our own history that we need to understand in order not to make the same mistakes in the future. And the final thing, and I want to end on this point, which is that the thing for me that has been the saddest thing, I suppose, about reading this report is seeing how completely weakened and undermined our state is. And by state, I mean the part of the state that is run by ordinary civil servants. and how they have been systematically weakened, and their work has been undermined through all of these processes. And creating the South Africa democratic administration was a big job and was a difficult job. And there are some remarkable civil servants whose work has been really undermined. And I think that is what then makes this project, the political project, a profoundly anti-developmental one. Because on the one hand, it is anti-developmental because you've got so much money leaving the country. I mean, we all know that the Asian tigers rose through corruption, I mean, South Korea was a deeply corrupt country through its development processes, but that corruption was developmental in the sense that the people that made, yes, there were people that got their 10%, but also a great deal of that capital was reinvested into the country, reinvested into developing all range of resources in that country. And what we know is that isn't happening, and that's profoundly anti-developmental. But I think the erosion of the state, the National Development Plan talks about building a capable state. And the thing is that all of those Asian tigers grew and were able to develop also because they had very capable states and dedicated civil servants that were allowed to do their jobs. And what is really unfortunate about this project is the way in which it has completely eroded the administration of the country. And that is a consequence that I'm afraid we're going to be dealing with for a long time in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Prof. Habib.
That's awesome.
So friends, colleagues, I'm going to try not to speak long because I think that people want to actually get involved in this debate. I do want to say a couple of quick things, however. Firstly, it's really wonderful that researchers across disciplinary boundaries and institutional boundaries can come together and do the kinds of work. I mean, often we talk about universities being engaged and research being engaged. I don't think you can get a better case study of an engaged research project. The second thing is actually, I read this report this morning and it really made my hair stand up. There were parts of it new, much of it I knew already, but the joining of the dots truly illuminates the political machinations at play. And it is an audacious political project. And it is truly astonishing that a society that claims to be as progressive and as activist as ours is would allow such an audacious political project to continue for so long without sanction or without intervention. It is utterly, it makes your hair stand up. So I want to say 5 big things, 3 in relation to the report, and then 2, one about what it means for the ANC, and then one what it means for the opposition. The first is on the radical economic transformation. Now the researchers correctly, I think, say that it's not simply about corruption, but it's a political agenda to repurpose institutions to create a black capitalist class. I think one must clarify here that even though it's a political project, they're very clear that looting is happening. They're not saying looting isn't happening. They're just saying you can't simply see it as looting. It's more than simple looting. It is involving an intervention into the political institutions. And the Guptas, this question was posed, what are the Guptas? The way I read the Guptas here is the economic interlocutors. There's lots of kitchen cabinets and multiple parts of the state. But the Guptas are the economic interlocutors, the brokers that organize the shift of resources from the state to a black capitalist class, a newly emerging black capitalist class. And there is looting in that process. Now here's the dilemma. If you're serious about the creation of a developmental state, you do need a black capitalist class. But you need a black capitalist class that is productive. And secondly, you need an empowerment of the economy, a broadening of the economy and intervention of workers, better wages, and economic inclusion as a process. And what is clearly happening in this process is neither of that is happening. Because the capitalist class that is emerging is essentially a capitalist class of the middleman, the one who takes some cash for arranging tenders. There is no new productive enterprises. If there's a productive enterprise, it's the existing one. And often the employment's going down, not up, and often the wages are going down, not up. So there is no productive capitalist class. In a sense, what you're getting, I think it was Amilcar Cabral that said, is the best example of the construction of a parasitic bourgeoisie. And if you have the parasitic bourgeoisie, it's profoundly anti-developmental. That's the danger. And there is no broadening of economic opportunities. There is no growth happening. There is no new enterprises happening. There is no new people being employed. So I worry sometimes, and I think you need to be more clear in this report, that looting is happening. The fact that it's a political project does not mean looting is not happening. And yes, there is the creation of a black capitalist class, but it's a parasitic capitalist class, not a productive one that is required for the developmental state. It's intimated. I think it needs to be said more boldly. The second, the recommendation of the researchers is that you have to have a new economic pact. One is that is inclusive and meets the needs and the agenda of the poor. Because what they're saying is we're in this mess because up till 2008, the poor were being excluded. There was a large-scale marginalization happening as there was some inclusion happening within the capitalist society. And I think that that's right. But I don't think it goes far enough. I think it's important to grow income at the bottom end of society. And it's important to alleviate poverty. But it doesn't on its own address our challenge. Because if our challenge in 2007 was inequality, not only poverty, but also inequality, then enrichment at the top also has to be challenged. That does mean in this new economic pact, you have to start saying to shareholders and investors, you need a long-term horizon. You have to start saying to CEOs and others that you need to start looking at remuneration caps. Because you can't address inequality by simply growing the bottom. You address inequality by growing the bottom but holding the top slightly there, because the trick is to bring the thing down. If you allow simply growing at the bottom, the guys at the top always grow faster because they've got assets. So the trick is you have to constrain at the top, otherwise you don't get to economic inequality. And so an economic pact is not simply allowing the poor to grow, which is absolutely important, but to say that there has to be some containment of the growth of the rich. And that, I think, is something that we've been ducking for too long in this society. And frankly, it's time we started saying it openly. The third is that some of the processes that enable state capture, the spreading of corruption, the looting, the repurposing of institutions didn't only emerge in 2008. What this report is showing is that actually some of it emerged as far back as 2000. So one of the classic examples is the disestablishment of the State Tender Board and how that created the decentralization of what effectively we were manning, the tenders, the decentralization of finances, but effectively what was also doing is the decentralization and spreading of corruption that effectively went up. And so when we're thinking about this, don't simply think that this is a post-2008 phenomenon. It became accelerated in 2008 and after 2011. But think through the importance of unintended consequences. I don't think when people decided in 2000 to get rid of the State Tender Board that they were planning to see what is happening now. But unintended consequences is important because, and I think that that's something that needs to be borne in mind for the next 2 points that I want to say. Now, what does this mean for the ANC? The danger for the ANC, it seems to me, is that this state capture has expanded opposition to an astonishing sense and threatens the ANC's electoral success. You saw it in the local government elections, the loss of major cities, and frankly, if things go on like this, 2019 is under serious threat. Now, should the ANC lose the state, there's a real interesting dilemma for the ANC. Firstly, its political project comes to an end, but more importantly, so does the project of all of the factions within the ANC, because it's all tied to having control of the state. The challenge for the ANC is what to do about this. Now, many in the ANC recognize this threat, but here's how they're hoping to deal with it. They're hoping to deal with it through a fight within the structures of the ANC. Here's the dilemma for that strategy. If you read this report is saying what you have is a combination of shadow structures and official structures. And the shadow structures and official structures cross over between state and party. And the truly astonishing thing is they're saying the official structures of both state and party are subverted by the shadow structures that exist. If your strategy is to fight within the ANC, then actually you're fighting on the real terrain of the power nexus that controls the shadow structures. You're fighting on the terrain of the power nexus itself, and you're determining and allowing them to determine the pace of the fight and effectively the form of the fight. Because the structures of party itself are compromised by the shadow structures. It's a bad strategy. Now, they haven't had the courage to say that, I suspect. But effectively, that's the problem. Because if you read this report, both in the official and the shadow structures, it's saying, or it's implying at least, it's a bad strategy if you think you're going to win this on the conference floor or the branch structures, because they've become very subverted by the shadowy structures that are accompanying it. And then finally, what about the opposition? The one lesson, the one thing that happened in Polokwane was effectively a coalition of the wounded emerged to take down Thabo Mbeki. And if any of you recall Polokwane, there was a huge debate about the unprincipled alliances that were emerging in the midst of Polokwane. And I remember having a conversation, I might add, with some people from the Communist Party around Jacob Zuma. And do you remember there was a third candidate that suggested that a debate had emerged around? And the argument was that how can you truly consider a debate of an alliance with Jacob Zuma given the charges that had prevailed? And the debate, among some at least, in the Communist Party is twofold. Rather the devil we know than we don't. And the second, we can evolve and marshal him in the right direction. Now, if you look at the last 9 years, I think the Communist Party got marshaled rather than Jacob Zuma. But the point that this puts forward is about what form of alliances. There's a long debate in social science research and political strategy about the strategic alliances and what form of alliances happen. Now, here's the dilemma you have. In the desire to take out Jacob Zuma, the opposition has developed all kinds of alliances. Some of the alliances, or at least some elements within that opposition alliance, actually have a political philosophy and an economic agenda very strikingly similar to Jacob Zuma himself. And that's what the report shows. That there was similar kinds of agendas, similar unconstitutional actions, similar subversions of political apparatuses, similar looting. It just happened at a different part of the state. But in the rush to get Jacob Zuma, all alliances are considered legitimate. The problem is this: you might simply be repeating the mistakes of the past. So my suggestion to the opposition is look at what happened in the build-up to Polokwane. Look at the spectacles that developed in the build-up to Polokwane and see what the consequences are today in Parliament. And my advice to the opposition, be careful. Be very careful lest you repeat the mistakes of our past. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all our speakers. That was mind-blowing in some respects. So now we're going to take questions from the floor. We'll go 3 at a time or 3 per round so that we can move quickly. I see one hand there, one hand here. Okay, we'll start with those two.
How we repeat the mistakes again.
And one hand here. Is there a roving mic?
Yes.
Yeah, there's one here.
It's this row here behind the camera.
Thank you, panel, for this wonderful discussion. There's so many questions that I can ask you, but I'm going to look at one. You're actually saying, or some of the speakers have been saying, that the judiciary cannot play a role in sorting out our politicians. Are you saying that the Constitutional Court, or we cannot, as the people, take matters to the Constitutional Court to get to the bottom of the way we think, the way we construct our arguments in order to bring these corrupt people down? One. Two, are you saying that the political process that we started, or the Constitution is unable to protect us from the political process that is right in place? Three, we're saying this, that the Constitution is also based to protect the neoliberals for stability from inception. So all of these ideas are juxtaposed to the fact that there's no delivery, and the Constitution itself is therefore unable to protect us. Then your point, Professor, would come into place that then we have to stand up and break the law, but that's not what I'm suggesting. What is it that can be done to address the situation in the processes that can be serious about how we can address these issues at hand? Thank you.
Hi there. Thanks to the panel. I don't know what you... I'm not sure what the collective noun for professors is.
Where's
Something.
We have a... I think it's faculty. Is it a faculty of professors? Anyway, congratulations to the faculty. I had 2 questions. I mean, the one is about the center of the operation, and whether there is a center, and if there is, where it's located. I mean, from what you've said, our president sits at the apex of this operation. But there are sections in the report, I haven't read it all, but I've skimmed it. I mean, there's sections that talk quite explicitly about him not being party to a lot of these deals, him being manipulated into meetings, and then people go away and manufacture stories about what has been agreed. And it seems that parts of what you've presented is that the president, I mean, he's abetting a lot of this, but he's not the architect or the brains that's driving it. I'm also not convinced that it's Saxonwald. I mean, I think Professor Habib's characterization of the Saxonwald mafia is correct. I don't get the impression that they're driving the intelligence operation. So anyway, I'm throwing that question out. I mean, is this a real decentralized network that's operating as a genuine network, or have we not yet scratched open where the locus of power is?
Thank you. My name is Ranjini Mansami. I'm from the Daily Maverick. The report presents an entire picture of what is fundamentally unethical and immoral and unconstitutional. Does it build a case for criminal prosecution? And if so, I know that you are not prosecutors, so you won't be able to say the extent of the case, but in your opinion, is there a case for prosecution? And if so, who can be prosecuted for on what charges?
Okay, panel?
I think I will just do the constitutional one.
Yeah, I can.
And,
Mr. Chair.
I just want to deal on this strategic center one, which has really plagued us. And there are times when you kind of end up saying, you've use your phrase, you've scratched it open. There it is. Got it. And then you just realize you get close to it and it unravels and there's a whole bunch of complex networks. And I'm just wondering whether our language is adequate for understanding what we're dealing with. And I've started to think of it, although we don't refer to it in the report itself, we don't use the word, as a virus. And I think a virus might be a more appropriate phrase. A virus operates according to a set of memes that are replicated. And it doesn't necessarily require a command center for the virus to take over an organism. But it does need repetitions of very similar transactions. And I think that's what's happening. And in the process, there's a multiplicity. There are a number of different elites that do compete with one another and contradict one another in the process. So that raises the question of Zuma. Zuma is not a Dos Santos. He's not a Putin. He'd like to be, but he just doesn't have the grey cells to make it work. You know? So I think the role that he plays is to anoint certain networks. So if a decision comes from certain networks that have been anointed, those decisions count. If decisions or recommendations come from other networks that are not, everybody knows are not the anointed ones, then they don't count. So that's why cabinet decisions are no longer significant. In the public service, you can say there's a cabinet decision. Well, is it the cabinet decision that matters or not? And that question is, underneath that question is, well, which network is sponsoring that? And has that one been anointed? And sometimes they get unanointed. You know, so it's quite a complex and it's not a very stable environment. So you have a set of viruses that create these connections and networks that are continuously shifting. But there is if there is a center, it's this capacity to anoint certain networks and remove that. And you have to be the last person who speaks to the man, to number one, if you really want your deal to go down.
Just to start, perhaps with what may appear as a straightforward question from Ranjani, I think it's very clear in my mind, at least, that there are individuals that have broken the law, that they have broken specific acts in the Republic, including the Tax Act, the Anti-Corruption Acts, I think the Executive Members Ethics Act. And all of these are detailed out in the Public Protector's report. There's been a collapse of corporate governance norms in state-owned and enterprises. And there's evidence of clear conflict of interest. If you look at the recent case that involves Machela Koko and his daughter, who is a director at Impulse. There is another case that may likely dominate the media with that involves Dangfang and General Electric. Dangfang is a Chinese state-owned enterprise that was flagged twice for corruption, first in Pakistan and two in China, and that simply front run everyone else, even though technically it didn't qualify for supply in terms of supply chain requirements.
Protect us as to where were they when this thing happened?
By individuals, so they are. Ben Gubane should go to jail. The CEO, the Eskom CEO is just come in. Brian Molife should go to jail. Some of the members, executives such as Anoj Singh, who prized open the door to these nefarious tendencies, and many others. So that in my mind, it's pretty clear that there are individuals that should go to jail, and there are dispensations against which you can hold them. And finally, I just want to respond to the point that Stembile had made. Fully agree with you, by the way, that it is a fundamental mistake to see the ANC as an eternal driver of transformative change in society. I think it's wrong. It's a betrayal of future generations. It assumes that we know the future that has not yet unfolded before us. And I think this messianic, this heroic conception of a liberation movement as a perpetual leader is fundamentally wrong and inconsistent. And I think we should reckon with that truth. And finally, I agree with you that we should avoid making mistake of discrediting wholesale, blanket discrediting of radical economic transformation. For the majority of Black South Africans, their hopes have been betrayed. The social legacy of apartheid is still there, but also the current elite has failed to discharge its responsibility to resolve that. But we should say that the use of this radical economic transformation is perverse because it seeks to mask and legitimate what is the fundamental pillaging of the state. Thanks.
So just so there's no mistake, the report is not prepared for lawyers. I mean, what we've done is just find processes. So this is an opinion. They should go to jail. I would prefer that opinion to be tested in a court. So we might not necessarily agree there. I think I think the report, and there's a lot of evidence, not just within this report, but that is exposed, which suggests that there's wrongdoing, and we hope that there will be investigated. But it does raise a big issue around, which has been raised so well by my colleague, around the relationship of this project to the weakening of state institutions. So one of the consequences of the politicization of the Hawks, for example, is that we know that there are a whole range of major political cases which are not being investigated and that have stalled in this regard. So as long as the Hawks have the current leadership, which they do, or actually I don't know who the leader of the Hawks is at the moment. As long as the police and the Hawks are configured in the way they are, and the way they remain so deeply politicized, these questions of taking up evidence in the public domain and exploring it for criminal prosecution is not happening. I mean, there's so many cases which are currently not being investigated. All those investigations have stalled. And then again, it speaks to the fundamentally undevelopmental character of the current project. The role of the Constitution here is important. And we have to say that it's unfortunate, I think, terribly unfortunate, that the Constitutional Court is being called on and playing a role in adjudicating on matters essentially not just of policy but of government process. It speaks to a weakness of our Constitution. I mean, we may celebrate many
actually make a tender. Is there anyone in Tswane who wants to say something?
Thanks, Chairperson. We do have a question from Pretoria.
All right.
Samukelo Masewa from Jacaranda FM. Just jokingly, Minister, why did you just release a statement? Then my question would be, what happens in the case that now Thabang Makwetla, Deputy Minister Thabang Makwetla, has been hijacked without his bodyguards? The vehicle that was hijacked, was it his personal vehicle or a state vehicle? And in my understanding, if it's a state vehicle, are ministers allowed to drive these cars, or they have to be in the company of their bodyguards each time when they go out with a state vehicle? Thank you.
That's all we have for now. Back to Cape Town.
Yes, if I may come back to you, if it was just as simple as a statement, you would not get clarity on all the questions that you would have actually asked now. It was his personal vehicle. It was not state. It's his personal vehicle. Ministers, when they get into state vehicles, they should be in the company of bodyguards for 24/7. But that was his personal vehicle. And like I said, he was going to see a friend and basically coming back. So you are right, that when I get into that car and I drive around and so on, I must be in the company of my bodyguards. Whether you go to Cubana or you go to wherever you go, in Soweto, you must be in the company of bodyguards, deep in the nightclub at night. So you must be in the company of bodyguards. So bodyguards will also be dancing there and all of that. So, but you must be in the company of bodyguards because you are state property. But in this instance, ministers do drive themselves from time to time in their own personal cars. It does happen. Thank you, Samuel.
Let's take a follow-up here. It's yourself and Ati. You're fine.
Thanks, Minister. Wendell from Reuters. I just want to find out, so what is crime intelligence suggesting is happening in KZN with regards to the political matters? If you guys are going big now, does that then mean that what you guys are picking up is that there's a possibility of an escalation of these targeted political murders? What are we looking to see now? I mean, are they? I know some of the killings were sort of, let's say, tripartite alliance killings, but others were different political parties, let's ANC, IFP, or whatever the case may be. So where are we going? I mean, if there's a big response now, why now? What are you guys seeing now?
No, I mean, obviously we can't give police, we can't give intelligence work. The point is that this thing is escalating, it's non-stop. It's happening, and it's now at a larger scale. Losing of one life, I think in itself it is too much. But it has always been politically inclined in terms of this crime of killing people and political people in KwaZulu-Natal, like you say, from all political backgrounds. So that is worrisome. But we need to follow up and apprehend those who have committed the crimes. General have spoken about the fact that we arrested more than 12 people in Ulundi. In that arrest themselves, those people who are arrested, they could be linked one way or the other to what is going on there. Those arrests are very much important in terms of the work that is being done. But the task team is specialized, focuses on that matter and resolving those crimes. Because once you get to understand who killed somebody, then you will then also link with what happens generally in terms of those who have given those a mandate. Because you must go beyond the guy who have pulled the trigger to the master behind. You know, that is what this task team must focus on and will focus on.
What I'm trying to get is there a sense that some of the killings are linked to sort of the whole political patronage system, where some people want access to the levers of power, whatever the case may be, and therefore send X person to get rid of Y councillor. I mean, what's your, or is it just, you know, what is it?
Yeah, from the face value, it looks like that. It looks like that because why will you go on and on killing councillors and people in political office and all of that? Contestation of power and terrain. And it has degenerated to the point that you can take lives. That is worrisome because politics doesn't have to mean that. If you are defeated, but when you get into the terrain now of eliminating people, that is gangsterism. So we must get into that, complicated as it is, but I can assure you that we'll make headway, and we're looking forward to big announcements on arrests and at the same time to get into the root cause of those who have committed these crimes.
I just wanted to check, in the context of what happened to DM Makwetla, at the policy level, is there any thinking to change the rules with regard to ministers driving themselves whenever they feel like? Thanks.
Well, in terms of the policy is very clear. Ministers are not allowed to drive themselves. So if from time to time you feel independent, that you can drive yourselves, you do that at your own risk. But from the point of view of the state, we are always ready to guard ministers. And that is why we dispatch, and the order is very clear. Don't leave the side of your bodyguards. And Chris Hani died in this country because he gave bodyguards a leave, because he thought humanly that they were tired, they needed to go home. It's Easter weekend. Anything can happen. When you are a minister or an ordinary citizen, but worse off as an important VIP like a minister, you need to always be in the company of your bodyguards. But to go and buy bread in the morning, you can't wake up guys to say, Matotan Funio, I want to go buy bread and milk. Can you please come closer, man? I'm leaving. You normally take, it's not a risk. We are citizens. After all these positions, we are normal, you know. But you can take your car and drink or whatever that it is and come back home. It is just that whatever happens in terms of crime, it's unplanned, it's spontaneous, and it happens anytime. But criminals will not come to armed people whom they know that this man is guarded. They will not. Our people are exposed to crime every day, irrespective. They don't have bodyguards. And they've got, so our task as the police and society, when we talk about this question of safety, it speaks to us in reality to understand that this thing called crime is real, you know, because it's not the fact that because you are guarded and all of that, but those who are not guarded are subjected to this on a daily basis. But ministers all the time in terms of policy must be in the company of their bodyguards. Anything could have happened to Tabang, the deputy minister, in the hands of those criminals. I mean, thanks to God that they didn't do anything. All they wanted was money. But the fact that we managed to arrest them, that speaks to the system that is fast and furious in chasing these criminals and finding them. But what is important is that these are not new people. It's one and the same people who go to the police station, get released, and then get paid, they come back. So we need, it speaks to the point of strengthening our criminal justice system. I can speak here as Mbalula, but as Minister of Police, I must speak here with the Minister of Justice. Look at the gaps. You know, those guys who are arrested, some of them, including that one who appeared in court, is a serial criminal. Then is found.
Because perhaps it's just anything that the last person who spoke to number one says it is, just as the National Democratic Revolution came to mean nothing actually other than what the ANC said it was, you know, a few hours earlier. So my question is, how do we make sure that those who vote in the majority for political parties and could be part of social movements around the country care about this looting more than the looting that has taken place for 300 years?
Thank you. So panel, please may we start with Stembile. Are you ready to?
Okay.
Yeah.
There was a question
Ooh,
to you.
Okay. I thought I could just sit back and relax. I agree with you about the need to find a definition or to define radical economic transformation in ways that aren't just who spoke to number one last. But I do think that one of the effects of the centralization of the looting is that it has really disempowered local elites from doing what they need to do, or from using the resources that they do have to try to mitigate the social challenges dealt with by the people where they live. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing such a resistance within the ANC. So that part of what we're talking about in some ways is sort of what is developmental corruption and what isn't. And I think that we mustn't... we like to talk as if, there's good guys and bad guys. This isn't a Marvel comic, it's really... And I think that one of the things that's happening is that the effects of the centralization of this whole operation, whether it works like a virus or not, is being felt locally in the provision of jobs, in the provision of tenders to do things, and is being profoundly felt in different ways to the corruption and the looting that has existed before that you've rightly mentioned. So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, and Ivor and I were, the event that we were at, there were many social justice activists, but people working in different areas, in housing, in health, in education. And what they kept going back to is the profound effects of the weakening of the state that are being felt in communities all over the country. So everything from basic paperwork and documents not being where they need to be, to people not feeling the need to do their work, but also people feeling really incapacitated from being able to do things that'll matter. Because one of the things that comes out very strongly in the report is that there are many policies that no longer really matter. Because ideas are being thought up, and we're going to, whether it's National Development Plan, even the set of ideas around nuclear, right, go against all of the work that has been done on renewable energy. So there's these incredible projects that have been done with independent power producers that are supposed to create black industrialists, really, that manufacture, that create jobs, that are being undermined by the political project around nuclear, not the energy things around it. And I think that that's just a big example of many smaller phenomena that we're seeing. And so I think that that is the difference with this new set.
I'm very interested in this question about historical looting and the present day looting. And it is true that a lot of, the South Coast economy is built on blood, and Lenin's track on, the imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism was built on South Africa as a case study, observing those developments. But also that kind of continued over periods of time. Now, what I think we should avoid is to reach for very simple moral equivalencies and say, look, these guys have looted, so these ones should loot too, because the effects are really terrible for societies. They're terrible for the majority of South Africans who have very little assets that could cushion them when the economy collapses, when the institutions collapses and the economy collapses, because institutional decay is often always the case, followed by systematic economic underperformance. And one can make an argument that under the successive from colonial to nationalist party governments, these acted very much consistently with their moral outlook. with their normative outlook, whereas the ANC is actively acting against its normative outlook. That is the moral claim to, the grand objectives of the struggle. So there are deep, profound inconsistencies with how the ANC works. So I think any type of corruption is bad corruption. It's bad for the country, even the so-called developmental corruption, because at what is the threshold of developmental corruption? How do we define it? How do we limit it? Because once we allow spaces for corruption, they multiply. And when they multiply, they will have a way of sucking the life out of public institutions and destroy trust between the public and those who are government leaders. I think we should be a society that doesn't tolerate any form of corruption. I mean, look at currently South Korea. The president is going to jail for small corruption. And I think, one minister, I think from Norway, was dismissed for purchasing a chocolate bar on her official credit card, because you've got to set the bar really high for both the present and the future generations. Thanks.
I'm sorry, I was going to shut up, but I really must come on this. I think that this is a serious danger when society says, well, people have been stealing and looting for 300 years now, why are we complaining? If I read this report, what it's saying is, look, there is rent seeking that can have developmental outcomes. And what it's saying is, this kind of rent seeking is not having developmental outcomes. That if you want to be serious, you have the option of either going the South Korea route or the DRC. And frankly, what is happening now is leading us to the DRC. That's what it's saying. And so I think we must be very clear that obviously this society is built on looting. And obviously the fundamental purpose of any political project now is to address the historical consequences of what has happened. It's not to create the circumstances for another group of looters to do it for another 100 years. And I think we need to be clear about that. Which does take me to one issue that came out earlier on, which I do worry about, that we've been silent on. Whether we like it or not, whatever the numbers are, 6 billion to 8 billion rand has left this country. When we resolve this issue and fix it, we better go after that 8 billion rand. That billion must not be left. And I think that's a lesson we must send. We must send a lesson that we will chase the money until we get it all back, because that then creates consequences. And people recognize that the next time they think about looting on a mass scale like they have now.
Let me address the question of the methodology. I think is an important question. I'm going to push it to Mark, but I do think you should read further in the report. I think you've only read one chapter. So I think, so what we've done, as we've said right at the beginning, the report is trying to put together different data sets, including from the media, reports including from Amabungani. But we've also looked at court papers, we've triangulated, I think that's the fancy term, with a whole range of other data sources, including information that is in the public domain, work on data from procurement. The heart of it methodologically is what we've tried to do is we've tried to periodize. So the question is, why are certain things happening at certain times? Why is it that you see a coincidence of events happening in particular moments? So why is it that, for example, you see events happening in the state-owned enterprises at roughly the same time as you see the assault on SARS, on the Hawks, and on the police? So I think you may be disappointed that we haven't found new facts, which I think is your right as a journalist, and I think we haven't claimed to find new facts, but what I think we've definitely done is we found a new analytical synthesis. There's one question on subaltern studies. So why I raised it, because subaltern studies, and which I think gives a route into understanding, I think, a profound and noble instinct in the Zuma campaign, in the post-Polokwane moment. And that is a sense that ordinary people uneducated people, people that didn't live in cities, that didn't speak English very well, that weren't educated especially or at all, those people were being left out of the current situation. And I think that's a fundamentally correct critique, and it's a fundamentally, it's a conviction which we have to deal with. And I think that does resonate with subaltern studies in the sense of giving voice to the voiceless. But, and here's the step, if you look at Partha Chatterjee's work, that distinction between civil society and political society, I think there's an erroneous slippage there. That precisely because people are excluded, the slippage is then that we assume that the institutions which are established democratically are never able to service those people, and therefore it is legitimate to break the rules and subvert them. Yeah. And I think you see that with subaltern studies' complicity in the phenomenon of the BNP in India. I think it's complicity in a whole range of, I think, quite diabolical social movements at a grassroots level. So that's in the sense, and here, Carlos Forment is a great anthropologist who's just been in Paris recently, and he used an expression, and I think it's very powerful, that what we're seeing is a certain kind of elite populism. In other words, an elite politics which justifies, in the name of the voiceless, a politics of subversion of constitutions and democratic rules. I think it's a very powerful insight.
As the last comment for tonight, as the convener of this amazing group that has worked together over only 8 weeks. Some of you in academia will know that the pace of academic production is not normally.
Come on, don't blame us.
And I think it would have taken a year and a half to kind of put this together in the traditional way. And it would not have been possible without incredible collaboration from a large number of journalists, government officials, the churches, individuals who have been mistreated and have stories to tell, who have made available, and a bunch of researchers like Chippy here and others who have done a lot of very detailed case study work. So I think we drew on all of that. But we are not journalists in the sense that the job of the journalist is to break a new story. That's not really our job. The job of the journalist is to break the news stories as often as possible, and the job of the academic is to collate those stories and make sense of them and put together an interpretation which we don't claim is right. We claim it is our interpretation. And if you find it useful for making sense of your reality, and therefore all future stories that the journalists then go and write, then we have made a contribution. That's what we do. That said, there are some new stories that we will, that we do want to tell, that the journalists have not yet broken. And these stories are tricky and dangerous and can't be told under many conditions. And we have to find a way of telling these stories. So if nothing happens to prevent us from telling those stories, we hope to be able in the future case studies to kind of pull together in the same way Amamungani stuff, other journalistic work, records, court records, personal testimonies, interviews, in order to assemble at a case level what's been going on in Transnet, in Eskom, in PRASA, in AXA, in Alex Corps, and so on and so forth, and Petrosa now, Duva, many others. What is going on in these? What's the meme? How does the virus work? What's the replication? What's the pattern? And I think that's what we will be hopefully being able to set out to do. So thank you very much for all those who contribute to this, and for Parry for hosting this event.
And one last remark, which Mark didn't mention as a convener, is that this is really a process convened by Mark and held by Mark, and it's really his urging and pressure and difficultness that has made this person work, really made this work. There's someone else who's remained anonymous in this process, Hannah Friedenstein, who's really been integral to the work that we've been done, and she needs to be a great tribute to her in this process. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you everyone for attending this evening. I'd like to bring this to a close and come full circle by saying enjoy opening your kitchen cabinets this evening. Good night.
But it came out of a series of seminars which we've just done. Adam, you were brilliant. It's completely right. It's completely right. No, it's completely right. No, your comments
we're never used to it. We're not used to this stuff, man.
I took my time.
You worked so hard. Sorry.
I was just making it simple for you.
Yeah, but you know, it's like when you give someone a lift.
Yes, yeah.
They still carry the bag inside the car.
Obviously, I agree.
And they have gotten so less, such less.
No, there's one that's missing.